Continuing our breaking news coverage on Penn State, locking up James Franklin. He agrees to a 10-year extension at Penn State, reportedly worth about $8.5 million a season. He'd be coaching the Nittany Lions through the 31 season. At least he's under contract through then. We know that college coaches can leave whenever they want to, and no buyout is too big if another school wants them. Franklin was rumored to be very much in the running at USC, but he is staying in Penn State in Happy Valley. Let's bring in Bryant McFadden, the former Seminole great, the two-time Super Bowl champ. BMAC, off-the-cuff impressions. What is your reaction?
I'm not surprised, Chris. Not surprised at all. This is what you have to do in college football if you have a premier-like coach, not just on the football field, but in the recruiting world as well. With so many jobs starting to open up, big name, prestigious-like jobs starting to open up. This is what you have to do, right? This is the market now for those type of coaches. We saw what Michigan State did with Mel Tucker, I think it was last week, giving him a nice, handsome ransom when you talk about pay raise and extending his contract just to kind of keep some of these other big name programs, off their heels. Penn State is a big name program. It's a traditional powerhouse. But when you talk about USC still being open, and his name was the first name to be associated with that job opening, and now LSU, and then, of course, the most recent opening is the University of Florida in SEC power. So this is what you have to do, and I think he's more than deserving of getting this contract extension and this huge raise.
Why is he deserving of it when you look at the numbers there? 4-5 last season. I know it was a weird COVID season. 7-4 this season when they were top 5 at one point earlier on in the year, and then things kind of fell apart for them.
Yeah, he's just been consistent. I think in his entire tenure there at Penn State, he has 62 wins and 32 losses. That's really efficient. That's consistent. Now, granted, when you talk about trying to compete for a championship, they've always fallen short to some degree. But they've been more than relevant, not just in their conference, but in college football as well. A lot of universities will love to have that consistency on the football field and the recruiting trail. So seeing what he's been able to do, granted, it's only going to be one or two usual suspects when you talk about coaches that are competing for championships. And that has been the storyline for a long time in college football, especially with Nick Saban still coaching. But me personally, seeing how consistent he's been, yeah, you got to stick with him. You got to ride with him because he's done nothing to not deserve a contract extension, especially with SC open, LSU open, and Florida open.
And he was rumored to. I mean, there were some people that were saying he's gone. He's going to USC. They were saying that weeks ago. That's not the case, and we don't know at this point if that was a James Franklin decision. If he said no, I want to stay at Penn State, give me a little bit more security here, or if maybe USC said we're looking elsewhere. So James Franklin and his agent went back to Penn State. What I want to know, BMAC, is why are so many of these 4- and 5-star kids going to Penn State? I mean, it's a storied program, right? But it's kind of in the middle of nowhere, cold weather this time of year. How is he able to get some of the best recruits in the country to go there?
I think he's relatable. I mean, when I came out of high school, I was a premier player, and Penn State came down to Hollywood, Florida, and I was like, oh, I'm okay. Tell Coach Paterno, no, thank you, but no, thank you. I'm okay. But to answer your question, yeah, you have to be relatable. You have to be able to relate to these kids. And it's not just about James Franklin. I think his entire staff, they're doing a real good job. And that's the most important thing outside of winning ball games is recruiting. Because if you can't recruit, you're not going to have an opportunity to be consistent and win big-time ball games year in and year out. You look at some of the best championship-worthy teams. They've all won the battle in the recruiting world. And for him to be able to do what he's been doing, getting kids to state college from the South, from the West Coast, Midwest, he's done a tremendous job in consistently doing so. And he's putting together a nice class as well. So when you factor in the class that he's putting together currently, when you factor in so many big time openings are available, and like you said, Chris, when SC became available, Southern California, everyone was saying, oh, James Franklin, James Franklin, James Franklin. You better do something because State College, sunny Southern California. You got to do something to kind of keep his interest right there where he's been over the last few years. So I think it's much needed. and you got to follow suit. Michigan State did what they did. It gave Mel Tucker the entire bank. You know what I mean? In only 2 years, right? In only 2 years. So if you Penn State, you saw what happened to your neighboring school there in the Big Ten. You better do the same thing if you want to keep him there in State College.
James Franklin agreeing to a 10-year contract extension. He'll be there at least under contract through the 2031 season. If he stays that long, we don't know. Coaches can leave whenever they want nowadays. Bryant McFadden with us here on CBS Sports HQ. He and Brady Quinn have said this is a good thing for Penn State. James Franklin has earned this. BMAC can be heard on the All Things Covered podcast with his cuz, Vikings cornerback Patrick Peterson. Vikings have it back to 500 at 5-5. Big game this week against the 49ers. Coming up on the other side of this quick break, Barrett Sallee will join us with his take on Penn State empty in the bag for James Franklin. James Franklin is staying at Penn State. He agrees to a contract that'll run for another 10 years through the 31 season, reportedly worth about $8.5 million per season. Franklin was thought to be one of the top candidates at USC, maybe LSU, a hot coaching commodity, and one of the best recruiters in college football, but it hasn't always shown in the records, especially the last couple of seasons. A losing record in 2020, and despite being in the top 5 at one point earlier this season, 7-4 and unranked heading into their final game of the season against Michigan State. Let's bring in Barrett Sallee. Talked to two people already, Brady Quinn and Bryant McFadden. They both said that despite what's happened over the last couple of years with the wins and losses, that this is very much needed at Penn State, and this is a huge win for Penn State. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. Clean sweep, 3 out of 3. James Franklin, in most years, has Penn State in the national championship conversation in November. And unless you're Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia, any of those teams, that should be acceptable. And a school like Penn State, yeah, it's got a storied tradition, but that's tradition. And James Franklin made that program relevant in a time that it was really hard for that program to get back on its feet. He did so quickly. 3 11-win seasons. You throw out the COVID year last year. It was so weird, especially in the Big Ten. And then this year, his quarterback, Sean Clifford, gets hurt twice. One of them was in the Iowa game. They probably would have won that game over a ranked Iowa team had Clifford actually been healthy. So James Franklin is, in more times than not, going to keep Penn State in that Big Ten East race until November and in the national title race until November. And at that point, you roll the dice. The chips fall where they may. And for Penn State, that's great. You've been in a spot on Championship Sunday with James Franklin with a chance to go to the playoff. Not many teams can say that. And on top of that, it's about the Jimmies and the Joes. State College is a very hard place to recruit to. But you look at the 24/7 team recruiting rankings right now, number 5, Penn State. And that's pretty par for the course for James Franklin. So I know, he has not had a ton of success, 8-9 in conference over the last couple of seasons. Throw out the COVID year. This year, some bad luck. He's still a dang good football coach.
What do you think this means for the other teams, USC in particular, LSU, that may have had James Franklin on their radar?
I don't think either one of them was actually going to hire James Franklin. I think this is a Jimmy Sexton special. I think Jimmy Sexton used those 2 jobs and potentially Florida right now in the recent to get this number up as much as it possibly could be. And James said that it's been like a 3-4 month process, and that might be true. That's also the time frame in which he changed agents to Jimmy Sexton. So the best thing that could have happened to James Franklin is USC and LSU coming open mid-season because he could use those for leverage. I never thought he would leave Penn State, and I really never thought that LSU or USC would hire him. That doesn't mean that he's not pretending and his agent isn't acting as if LSU and USC were calling.
Okay, LSU, USC, Florida. I mean, huge programs in need of a head coach. Where do we stand right now with those openings?
Well, I mean, I think LSU right now, they're going to ask Jimbo Fisher, probably in the locker room after they play in Baton Rouge on Saturday night. He's probably going to say no. But they do have to ask. Scott Woodward and Jimbo Fisher, go way back. So I think that's going to be one thing that does happen. In the end, I think LSU is probably going to wind up with Billy Napier, who would be a phenomenal head coach. It's not the splash. They don't need to make a splash. They need to win. Billy Napier is the right guy. And for Florida, I think it might be Mario Cristobal, or at least they want to have that conversation quickly, because had Oregon not lost to Utah, they might have made the playoff, in which case you wouldn't be able to hire Cristobal until December 31st. Now that Oregon's out of the playoff run on Saturday night, Florida fires their coach Sunday morning. Coincidence? I don't know about that.
Barrett, Sallee with us here as we start to see things come into focus a little bit more on the coaching carousel. James Franklin, off the market, at least we think. He's got some buyout money. I mean, they're going to have to spend a lot to buy him out of that, but we know no coach is ungettable if a big-time school wants him. But Penn State is getting James Franklin to agree to a 10-year extension through the 2031 season. Much more on that, coaching carousel, and rivalry week in college football on the Cover 3 podcast.
Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.